Hello, this is Jimmy Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump directs Pentagon to start testing nuclear weapons, or in parentheses, original title from thehill.com, posted by Dr. Who07. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for nuclear weapons. I think they're just destructive, and it's just going to destroy land needlessly. But, ultimately, if the government wants to test nuclear weapons, they should be able to. I think the libertarian position is like for every other weapon. If individual people want to own nuclear weapons, they should be able to. But ultimately, I personally don't really care for them and the destruction they cause. But ultimately, people will have whatever access to weapons, whatever they want. They can justify using them or not, and that does include nuclear weapons. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Pentagon readying thousands of guard reaction forces as U.S. mission widens from WashingtonPost.com. Posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the National Guard in the streets, but I think it's mostly just political theater, It's just Trump they're trying to make Trump look like a strongman dictator, even though, I would argue like he's very much like Joe Biden. He's not really the one running the show. The people running the show are the military-industrial complex, deep state actors, and the FBI, CIA, NSA, and all the other government agencies, and probably corporate interests like big business as well, and also probably foreign interests. You can't forget Israel and the rest of those. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Why Hasn't She Been Sworn In Yet? Posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the Ask the World subreddit, which looks like it's since been removed by moderator. And that's a picture. That's a tweet from. That's a Blue Sky post from Vex Papu Snarky Boo, and they tweeted. Swear in, hold the vote, release the files, and that was them sharing a headline, breaking news. Adelita Grujava now holds longest wait to be sworn in of any U.S. House special election winner in decades. And that's how, I think they're not swearing her in because, she says she's going to be the vote that will push them over to release the Epstein files. But, personally, I don't know, I guess you can make the argument that the government's technically shut down right now. That's what they might say, and maybe that's why the government's never going to reopen at this point, because they don't want to release the Epstein files. But even if they do vote to release the Epstein files, chances are we're not going to get them in full, because if they release them completely unredacted, that's just gonna completely destroy any trust that people have in the government, and people will just start viewing it as illegitimate, even though I would argue that the government is inherently illegitimate. The only thing that makes it legitimate is its monopoly on the legal use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have top Trump officials are moving onto military bases, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross-post from the military subreddit, which has since been removed by the moderator, it looks like. And yeah, I guess it's I guess it was this a post from Axios. Trump officials flocked to DC military housing over safety fears. And yeah, personally, if I was an official in the Trump government, I'd probably have safety fears as well. Like, look what happened to Charlie Kirk. If you're working for the Trump administration, you're probably going to be inherently seen as a Nazi by all the delusional Redditors. So, I personally think I personally don't care for any government worker or official. But ultimately, I don't think violence is ever really the answer. So I don't think. But ultimately, if they think, if people want to justify using violence, they should be able to. But that being said, I definitely do think a lot of Trump officials are probably justified by moving into military housing, because there's a lot of delusional Redditors out there who might take them out any second for working for Trump or for social media wrongthink. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have They Want You to Suffer, It's by Design, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross-post from the Work Reform subreddit. And that looks like a video from YouTube, reminding you of what this billionaire said 2 years ago. And the billionaire looks like he says, we need to see unemployment rise to, rise. I don't know, it's just probably some billionaire jerking himself off. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for any of the billionaire elites. Not all billionaire elites are bad, but, a lot of them are bad because they want to control you, and this seems to be one of those types of guys. I think that's very much what the elites, both in the government and the private sector, want to control people and make them as miserable as possible, so they'll become dependent on the state, and that's how they want to implement their globalist Marxism, like the WEF says. And it's like they say, you will nothing, you will be happy, and that's not something that I particularly care for, but it's ultimately, it does come down to who has the power to do what, and that's ultimately why I think people need to start seeing big government and big business as altogether the elites as openly as against them, and they need to reject their authority and just try and be happy and with their current life, because the elites want to make them as miserable and broken, so that the people, so that they'll be easier to rule over when it comes to implementing their globalist Marxism. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, he died at first in solitary confinement. Now his family is suing for answers from Reason.com. And that was posted by Fear the Creeper, and they added, after 51-year-old Lamont Mealy was found dead in a Maryland prison cell, officials called it natural causes. His family's lawsuit says guards intentionally shut off his water. And yeah, just go show you, the state can abuse you however it feels like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. This guy, I would argue this is a good example why we shouldn't have government-run prisons. They should be privately run, because the government, when they house you, they can potentially kill you by shutting off your water, and then say, oh, it's natural causes. I personally don't really care for prisons as a whole, but you do have to take some of the violent degenerates off the street. And but I personally think for everything else, the private sector needs to be doing that rather than the public sector, because private corporations can be authoritarian as well, but at the very least they're not the state, who seeks to control everyone through its legal monopoly on the use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Republicans America, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the Ice Raid subreddit. Families should be able to enjoy holiday period without fear of being terrorized by ICE, but this is Trump's America. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for ICE, just like any other law enforcement, but ultimately that they can pretty much do whatever they want to, since they have the legal monopoly on the use of force. A lot of Redditors say, oh, I'm against ICE, but they were completely fine with any law enforcement when it came to COVID restrictions and authoritarianism. It just goes to show you, people say, oh, I'm against government authoritarianism, but then they'll justify it when their party's in power. I'm sure if ICE was going after the MAGA people and putting them in re-education camps, Reddit would think they're the greatest thing ever. But since they're going after illegal immigrants who are viewed as more as an in-group category than an out-group category, at least among left-leaning Redditors, they're the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Chuck Schumer says quiet part out loud. It is mind-boggling how so many boomers think this is convincing. Posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Boomers Being Fools subreddit. And it looks like Chuck Schumer saying something on top of an IPAC background at like an IPAC press conference. And yeah, personally, I don't really care what he's saying. I think the background's more than enough to say that Israel pretty much completely controls the U.S. government outside of a few select holdouts like Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, maybe a few others as well. And yeah, I personally don't think Israel, a foreign power, should be controlling America. But ultimately, the U.S. government is for sale to the highest bidder, and a lot of times that happens to be Israel, and that's why I think we need to declare our independence from Israel. But I think it's too difficult at this point, because social media is pretty much very anti-Israel now. But real life has a lot more pro-Israel people in it than anti-Israel people. And yeah, personally, I think the only way out at this point is I think sadly the only way out is just completely dissolving the union. It's shown it's inherently corrupt and irreformable. And yeah, I think it was good while it lasted, but I think it's time for people to move on and maybe we could and make their own governments rather than have this one, which is clearly not working and hasn't been working for decades at the very least. You could argue even centuries if you go back to like the Civil War. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, I think we need voluntary government rather than forced collectivist government. I think if each individual wants to form their own government, that's fine. And if individuals want to have a voluntary association governments with each other, I think that's fine. I think the libertarian position is, each individual should form collectives however they feel like. But right now you have one big centralized collective in Washington, D.C., and I think that's very anti-libertarian. Next we have State Socialism and Anarchism, 1888, from the anarchistlibrary.org, posted by Anarcho Federation. They said, I haven't been active here for a while, but I returned to some rather unfortunate arguments about historical libertarianism as originated in radical socialist circles. First, whenever socialism comes up, please refrain from the poor public education and indoctrination. All socialism is Marxist states and regimes, authoritarian industrial management, and bureaucratic oligarchy. Well, this is true of most Marxist schools. It's not even true of all Marxist schools, let alone socialist schools. Libertarianism originated from radical socialist critique of capitalism and industrial modernity and political economy and economics as a movement for a class society inherent to all socialist ideas, a movement for broader liberation, addressed hierarchies of all forms, looked to the construction of all systems of dominance, thus anarchism/libertarianism coming to the political arena in modern history. As r/libertarian censor is a space for left and right libertarians to explore, discuss, debate, and argue. I plan on being more involved so as to explore the origin and history of libertarian movements, most of all dispel myths about what is libertarianism as a socialist ideal and what is meant to be by critique of capitalism. I wish to start with the article from individualist free market anarchist Benjamin Tucker, one of the originals of American libertarian philosophy. In this article, Tucker differentiates, explains, and articulated the two socialisms. And yeah, personally, I think all socialism is going to end up being inherently authoritarian. You know, it's a lot like communism. It's supposedly going to work in theory, but in practice, you're going to get tyrants like Stalin and Mao. I know socialism is in communism, but they most often fall into the same pitfalls. And I think that's very much the libertarian perspective on them. You know, I think if you want to do voluntary socialism and have like a voluntary socialist collective, I think that would be fine from a libertarian perspective. But I think for the enforcement of socialism through the state is inherently wrong, just like the enforcement of anything else through the state is going to be inherently wrong. And yeah, you know, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have U.S. poised to strike military targets in Venezuela as an escalation against Maduro regime, from MiamiHerald.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but you know, the U.S. government can bomb whatever country it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. You know, it's been dropping bombs over the Middle East for decades, and people just kind of shrug it and move on at this point. Next we have the Senate just voted to strip Donald Trump of his power to impose tariffs. And then in parentheses, unfortunately, the House GOP are still enjoying endless paid vacations, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-posted from the Cringe TikTok subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, you know, that's good, but ultimately Congress has very little power at this point, and the real power in Washington ultimately lies with the president. Because that's how it's historically been going since the Civil War. The Congress used to be the more powerful one, but now it's the president pretty much because of people like Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but you know, ultimately, political power, just like all power, is whatever people are willing to justify at any given second. You know, if Congress wants to say Donald Trump can't impose tariffs, that doesn't mean he can't justify saying I'm going to justify it anyway. You know, it ultimately comes down to whose authority people are willing to follow, and a lot of the time that a lot of people are gonna deflect to whatever the president of the United States says, even if he's not legally allowed to do something. Next we have Voluntary Socialism, posted by Anarcho Federation, and they said, let us cross that bridge. Voluntary, and that's from the Arkansas Library, by the way, let's cross the bridge. Voluntary Socialism is a work of nonfiction by American multi-mutualist Francis Dashwood Tandy, 1867 to 1913. First published in 1896, it was favorably cited by many individuals anarchists, including Clarence Lee Schwartz, minarchist Robert Nozick, and left libertarian Robert T. Long, who said many of the standard moves in market anarchist theory are already in evidence in Tandy. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, you know, if people want to form voluntary socialist collectives, I'd be fine with that, but I'd be against enforcing socialism on anyone else. You know, enforcing an ideology on anyone else is going to be inherently authoritarian. Even libertarianism, I would say, you know, if you're enforcing libertarianism, other people don't want it, you know, that's authoritarian. You know, libertarians are, you know, you do you, I do me, and that's my thoughts on that issue. And let's see if there's anything new. Looks like there's nothing. Looks like there's a new post. Trump's National Guard plans edges the U.S. closer to a permanent federal police force, from Reason.com, posted by Jade Porcupine. And yeah, as I said earlier, you know, I personally don't care for the National Guard in the streets, but you know, I think all government law enforcement is pretty much the same. They all think they can get away with anything they want to because they have the legal monopoly use of force. Well, in reality, it comes down to, who wants to justify what. Just because you have the legal monopoly use of force doesn't mean I'm not able to fight back if I don't want to. You might control the court system as well, and the prison system as well, but, it just goes to show you that, just because you control all the legal system doesn't mean I have to obey everything you say. The libertarian perspective is, just by doing whatever you want to. Even if the legal system says you can't do something, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to do it if you don't feel like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.